Okay, so a couple of weeks back, we did a sponsored video on Outcast: A New Beginning, which really interesting project. This because THQ Nordic came to us and said, "Have you got any concepts that you could, possibly produce some custom editorial around?" And I didn't know much about the game, but John did, and he was quite excited about it. And I think the final video that we put up, you've got to check it out, right? Because this is a fascinating game that came out in 1999, and there's a story there, a through line that brings us up to an actual sequel that finally happened like 24,
Right.
25
Yeah.
years later. So do check out that video. But one thing which we didn't do, because the nature of a sponsored video is that it's not a review, is that we didn't really review it. And
Correct.
John, do you want to take up the story there? I mean, let's talk
Sure,
about
sure,
the
sure.
sponsored video first of all, because it's a great piece of work.
Yeah, so the reason I was interested in this and what pleased me about them asking about it is they kind of wanted a DF retro style retrospective to some degree, which was perfect because I am a gigantic fan of the original Outcast. I've had a deep respect for that game. As you'll see in the video, they were doing some crazy stuff and pushing PC graphics and tech in a very different way from the rest of the industry at that point. And there's some very forward-looking things in there. But then those guys tried to make the sequel, Outcast, The Lost Planet. I can't remember the full name. It is the second Outcast for PlayStation 2,
Right.
but they basically ran out of money, or at least the publisher kind of reduced their funding and they couldn't actually make it, so it got canceled. And what's wild is that the game we did just get last month or this month, I guess, is a game that it's these same guys that had been trying to get this thing made for decades. They went through so many hoops and they somehow managed to stick it out, get back together again, and actually make it happen. And it's a crazy story, and I think it's really cool that they actually did manage to make it happen because the game is a lot of fun. It has a lot of similarities to the original game in terms of the structure, but they also pushed out the move set so that, you're a dude with a jetpack now, which is fun. And as a result, it ends up, and the way they built the world it's so vertical and so interesting in a way that's different from your typical open world game. And you can get around it pretty quick, that it ends up feeling more like a 2000s era 3D platform game with Outcast trimmings in a weird way. Like just climbing to the top of the spire to visit that desert city. It took me like 30 minutes to get up there, and you could fall at any point, which added a feeling of risk. So when you actually did make it to the top of that giant spire, it really felt like you came a long way to reach that point, which I thought was really engaging. So the game is cool. It's interesting. There's a lot of story history behind it, but unfortunately, it launched with some issues on consoles. And this is where we get into the console test, because for that video, I actually just used the PC version, which, while it didn't run it well initially, before launch, they did patch it and the performance went up like dramatically. Like I was getting like 30 FPS in the villages on my PC, and that went up to over 100 frames per second by the time the final version actually released. So huge improvement there. But yeah, console versions. After that, we actually thought, hey, maybe we should talk about this on DF Direct. So we prepared to do a segment last week.
Yeah.
Problem is I was trying to measure the frame rate on PS5, and I was like, Rich, like the results I'm getting here doesn't make sense. Like it's not tracking correctly. And
Yes.
obviously, we have a lot of experience with, oh no, this game is doing something weird. And I thought, okay, Rich being the expert on this, I punted it over to you. And you're like, okay, I'll take a crack at this. I got this. And then within 30 minutes of loading it up, you're like,
Yeah, there was
this
some
is
weird.
this is messed up.
Yeah, I mean, if okay, so yeah, the story there is that we were given the PlayStation 5 build, right? And the quality mode basically just runs at 30 frames per second, as you'd expect.
Yep,
Mostly consistent frame pacing, occasional drop frames. It's okay.
it's fine. Yeah,
Fine, not exemplary, but it does the job. Performance mode basically on the PlayStation 5 is a bit of a tearing fest. And yeah, basically calculating frame times with tearing is a bit more challenging. But we've dealt with like games going back to the Xbox 360 era that do that but there were some really odd responses coming back here. But we can talk about things in broad terms, and we've got some what I would consider to be accurate numbers here. And it kind of highlights the issue with the PlayStation 5 version specifically, which is that, well, what can I say? The screen tearing is obnoxious, I think, on the PlayStation 5 build. It's kind of present on all sectors of the screen, and it seems to, be sort of very present in the middle and the bottom, which is, in the middle is kind of like where your eyes are typically resting, right? So that's really not good. So the performance mode on PlayStation 5 has these issues with tearing, and it's all very odd. It doesn't really make sense, but this is how it is. These are the clips that I got out, which do represent the game as I believe it presents, and it's all very odd. However, it seems to me that when the tracking is working correctly and we're getting correct response frame rates and frame times, it's under 48 frames per second. And John, you noticed that the game actually supports VRR. It has a bespoke 60 hertz VRR mode. And obviously the VRR window on PlayStation 5 in that scenario is basically 48 hertz to 60.
Correct.
So we've got a VRR mode here, which might possibly be causing issues for the performance mode without VRR, but tell me how the VRR mode presents to you.
Yeah, so that's what's weird is, so on PlayStation 5, as I think you guys are aware, there is an option to toggle it for unsupported games, right? So it just works on whatever. But if you have that off, games can initialize VRR themselves, and Outcast is one of those games. But like many other games that do enable VR on PlayStation 5, I feel like the developers perhaps didn't fundamentally understand something about the way it works, or didn't consider all the implications of this, because you would want to offer a 120 hertz output mode so you could do low frame rate compensation, which we know is possible and it does work. It's just that that's not what we get here. It's 60 hertz. But in this case, what happens is with VRR is anytime the frame rate is above 48, there is no tearing. It actually looks completely smooth and great. But the frame rate drops below 48 a lot. And so what ends up happening is you get this ping pong effect where you've got like nonstop screen tearing appearing, followed by zero tearing and fluid performance. And the way it bounces back and forth between the two is extremely jarring and strange, because you're just like, it's like you're dropping in and out of VSync, but with a 48 frames per second like floor. So you can kind of see what they were going for, but it doesn't really work. And I have to wonder if whatever they're doing to enable that at VRR mode and the way the tearing behaves there, if that is somehow related to the way it presents in the non-VRR mode, which is in turn making it really difficult to track those tear lines.
But even so, it just looks bad.
It's bad, yeah.
On a non-VRR screen.
One thing to be noted, though, in the email we talked about, they did say that they are still working on some kind of major performance boosting patch for this.
Right.
I don't know when that'll hit, but they do at least seem confident that it will get noticeably better. And to a degree, I can believe it, because prior to, I tried it on PS5 before one of the patches went live, and that version actually had broken frame pacing in the 30 FPS mode. It was extremely bad. And I actually sent that along to them, like, hey, this is not good. There should be a way. Right? They fixed it. And it is, there are some hiccups and traversal stutters, but the incorrect frame pacing that initially presented was like constant and really bad, and that is solved. So they are at least making strides in those areas, and I would like to hope that they could figure out a way to get it, because I mean, fundamentally it's still a pretty small team, right? This is not a AAA game by any means. It's a small team trying to make something that's visually pretty ambitious for Unreal Engine 4, I'd say. It
looks really nice, I think.
It's a beautiful game. So I can see why they would be struggling with it for that. But I have some hope. But anyway, Rich, after we figured out the PlayStation version, you went ahead and bought it on Xbox to check this version out.
Well, the reason I bought it on Xbox is that we actually recorded this segment for DF Direct Weekly last week, and we needed some assets to back it up, right? And so, I took a look at the PlayStation 5 code, which you've got, and thought, this is just really, really bizarre. What's going on here? How can I actually get workable performance data to go on the Direct. And so I thought, okay, well, look, maybe the Xbox version will track correctly. So I bought the Xbox version and took a look at it. And if we look at Series X, actually, there are issues there. There are profound performance implications as there are on PlayStation 5, but it tracks almost perfectly. It looks fine. And it's typically what we would expect from an Xbox game or a console game more generally, which is that the tearing is kind of kept at the top of the screen and it's not really as noticeable, but there are still some pretty bad frame rate drops. But it looks sort of okay for the most part. The busiest scenes do drop pretty badly, though.
Did you get a chance to try VRR on that? I'm actually curious about that.
It should present okay, though, based on what we're seeing here just from VSync off.
I'll have to test that because I feel like that's kind of the key. And we saw this with Dragon's Dogma 2 that Oliver mentioned as well as on Xbox. At 120 hertz output, you get that LFC, which means that those lower frame rates actually do present correctly and smoothly. So that could work.
Yeah, Xbox kind of presented as I would imagine. Now, performance mode still has issues. It kind of reminds me of an old, Xbox One X or PS4 Pro game where they just remove the frame rate and you have like highly variable performance.
Yep.
So it's okay, but not great. But VRR probably would help there, assuming it's works as usual. Then we move on to Xbox Series S, which also has quality and performance modes. The issue being that both of them run at 30 frames per second locked or capped. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. So hopefully things will improve there. I mean, ultimately, if you are running this game at 30 FPS, which you've kind of got to have a consistent experience, it's all right, It's okay. And it certainly looks the part, and I'm not sure it's being sold at, actually I think it is being sold at high-end AAA prices. Like $60.
Really?
I think I paid like a fair amount of money for it. So, yeah. But I think the point is that hopefully there will be some improvements coming. They've said as such. We've already had
60,
improvements.
it looks like $60.
Yeah. It's a really interesting game. I do like your pitch, though, John, which is, hey, we got a jetpack.
Yeah, no,
Maybe that was what was missing from the PlayStation 2 pitch back in the day.
Yeah, that's a fun thing to think about. It's a weirdly fun and enjoyable game. And it also, I made this video when I was sick, recovering for that week with COVID. So I have this like weird, like feverish memories of playing through this game. And it was kind of like being I was locked in my room in quarantine during that whole period. So it was just like me and Outcast for like a week. And it was such a trippy experience. I ended up playing through the whole game.
It looks good, right? But it is really old school. And I don't actually begrudge it for that at all.
I agree. It feels like a PS2 era game, but in a really fun way. Like, there's something very delightful about it. It does not take itself that seriously. Just, it's got that fun playfulness and that sci-fi edge that I love. It's the whole Stargate kind of thing, right? Where you get the humans landing on this, like in this alternate universe and doing their business. And the plot it is actually funny. Like there's a lot of parallels with Avatar, the film,
right.
But all this plot stuff existed for Outcast 2 back in like 2001. So like the plot that they're telling here is what they were trying to tell on PlayStation 2, and all the old design documents bear that out. So it's kind of funny how I've seen comparisons to Avatar, but it's like, well, these guys are kind of doing that thing first. So
certainly.
Totally interesting. The one thing to take away, though, is we're talking about the performance. It did make me chuckle a little bit because the original Outcast, it was basically known for running horribly at the time.
Yeah.
Because they were doing stuff. They were trying to do stuff without 3D acceleration support, but supporting features that you would typically expect from 3D acceleration, along with that crazy height map terrain system and all this kind of stuff. And on PCs, I played it on my Pentium 3 PC, which would have been like ultra high end for when this came out. And it was mostly like a 20 FPS experience, like 20 to 25, at 512 by 384 resolution in letterboxed mode.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, a mid-spec PC in 1999, you would have been like 15 FPS at like 320 by 240.
Oliver, I guess you've not really had too much experience of this game.
No, I've not looked at it,
Look,
but it does always get the heart racing and makes me very nervous when I start up a new game and there's some form of tearing that's not tracking with our tools, and then it's like, oh, jeez,
I know.
It's just like
you have to go deep.
This is a headache. Where do I crop? Do I set the noise to this and all this? And it's a huge pain.
Oliver, I will. As a fun aside, you missed some of the old days of DF tearing.
Sure, that was worse.
The software was a lot worse, I would say. Although it was more, it was somehow more flexible. Like you could do more stuff manually with FPS GUI, but it didn't track tears all that well for a while. And when I did that 2014 Shadow Warrior analysis on the video, I spent an entire day, like 8 hours, manually entering tear lines one by one by clicking them in because I couldn't get it to track. I'll tell you, man, you did not miss that.
Yeah, I would just like to say to any developers who might be listening, please don't include tearing in your games, especially if you're tearing at high frame rates, because then it's just like,
oh gosh,
geez, it just becomes like, how do I do
the
this?
calculations get a bit tenuous and difficult at that point.
Yeah.
Wasn't there something weird with Gran Turismo 6 where the tear lines drew at the bottom of the screen? Like they did like a reverse
There's been
image?
a couple of situations where that has happened, and it's just kind of weird. So,
I think in GT6's case, they did it because if you were racing in cockpit view, all the tearing would occur only in the cockpit area of the screen,
right.
So you actually wouldn't notice it.
Yeah, there's also
So, like,
Baldur's
the 3D
Gate 3 also does tearing in the bottom of the screen.
Oh,
it's just
okay.
Not
Yeah, we all hate screen tearing, don't we, gents?
Well, it's also just not a good. I don't think it's a good experience for the player, but it's definitely not a good experience
No,
for the reviewer trying to analyze this stuff.
I would say whatever additional input latency gains you get out of disabling VSync on a console, it's not worth it. It just ruins the image integrity. It looks terrible.
Okay. I think that's all we've got to say about Outcast. Really interesting game. Check out the video that John did on it because the history is just fascinating. They developed, dare I say it, bespoke technology, and they couldn't produce Outcast 2 on the PlayStation 2, but they did produce games on PlayStation 2 that used that technology. And I think one of the takeaways from your video, John, was just how good those games looked from the PS2.
Yeah, there was like super low budget little extreme sports games. They were doing some crazy stuff like that water rafting game where it's like all this weird kind of physics driven water system that actually still looks good, where it really looks like water rushing down a mountainside and it reacts to the player. And there's a lot going on there where you're just like, huh. And they did that at full frame rate too, like 60 FPS or 50, depending on what is power and TSC.